Before the United States officially entered World War II, the country was deeply divided. The memory of World War I was still fresh, and many Americans believed that getting involved in another European conflict would be a mistake. Isolationism was strong, both among the public and within political circles. The idea of staying out of foreign wars was not just popular, it was policy. Laws had been passed specifically to prevent the United States from being drawn into another global conflict. Yet, behind the scenes, the situation was already shifting. And at the center of that shift was President Franklin D. Roosevelt. If you want to understand the real decisions that shaped World War II, make sure to subscribe to World War II Confidential. It helps support the channel and allows us to continue bringing you real, historically accurate stories based on facts, not fiction. Roosevelt did not immediately push the United States into war. Instead, he began by carefully navigating the political landscape. Publicly, he acknowledged the desire to remain neutral. Privately, he understood that the global situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. Germany was expanding across Europe, and Britain was under constant pressure. If Britain fell, the balance of power would shift dramatically. Roosevelt saw this as a direct threat, even if the United States was not yet involved. His challenge was not just strategic, it was political. He needed to prepare the country for a war that many did not yet want. One of the first steps was redefining what neutrality meant. Officially, the United States remained out of the war. But policies began to change. Programs were introduced that allowed the U.S. to support countries fighting against Germany without directly entering the conflict. This included providing weapons, supplies, and financial assistance. These actions were controversial. Critics argued that they were pulling the country closer to war, while supporters believed they were necessary to prevent a larger threat. Roosevelt framed these decisions as measures to protect American interests, not as steps toward direct involvement. At the same time, Roosevelt used communication as a key tool. Through speeches and public messaging, he began shaping how Americans viewed the war. He emphasized the risks of inaction and the importance of supporting nations that were already fighting. This was not a sudden shift. It was gradual, designed to influence public opinion over time. Roosevelt understood that entering a war without public support would be difficult to sustain. He needed to build acceptance before taking any major steps. As tensions continued to rise, the line between neutrality and involvement became less clear. The United States was not officially at war, but it was no longer fully separate from the conflict. Roosevelt had begun to position the country in a way that made entry into the war more likely, even if it had not yet happened. The situation was moving toward a point where a single event could change everything. And when that moment came, the groundwork had already been laid. As the war in Europe intensified, Roosevelt continued to move the United States closer to involvement without formally entering the conflict. One of the most significant steps was the introduction of the Lend-Lease Act in 1941. This policy allowed the United States to supply weapons, equipment, and resources to countries considered vital to American interests, most notably Great Britain. Instead of selling arms under strict neutrality laws, the U.S. could now lend or lease them, effectively bypassing previous restrictions. Roosevelt described it as helping a neighbor whose house was on fire, providing a practical justification for what was, in reality, a major shift in policy. The impact of Lend-Lease was immediate. American factories began producing large quantities of military equipment, which were then shipped across the Atlantic. This support played a crucial role in sustaining Britain during a period when it faced constant pressure. However, it also increased tensions with Germany. Supplying one side in an active conflict made true neutrality impossible. German leadership was fully aware of this, and it began to treat the United States less as a neutral nation and more as an indirect participant. Roosevelt understood this risk, but he also believed that supporting Britain was necessary to prevent a larger and more direct threat later. At the same time, the United States began taking a more active role in the Atlantic. American naval forces were tasked with protecting shipping routes, particularly those carrying supplies to Allied nations. This led to encounters with German submarines known as U-boats. While the United States was not officially at war, these interactions brought American forces into direct contact with German military operations. Tensions escalated further when incidents occurred at sea, including attacks on U.S. ships. Each of these moments increased the pressure on Roosevelt to take a clearer position. Despite these developments, Roosevelt still faced strong opposition at home. Many Americans continued to resist the idea of entering the war. Political groups and public figures argued that involvement would lead to unnecessary loss of life and resources. Roosevelt had to balance these concerns while continuing to prepare the country for a possible conflict. His approach remained cautious but deliberate. He avoided direct declarations, instead taking incremental steps that gradually shifted the United States from neutrality toward active support. By late 1941, the situation had reached a critical point. The United States was no longer simply observing the war. It was deeply involved in supporting one side, protecting supply routes, and preparing its military for potential engagement. The distinction between being at war and not being at war was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Roosevelt had moved the country to the edge of involvement, but one final step remained, and that step would not come from policy or planning alone. It would come from an event that would force a decision. By late 1941, the United States was already deeply involved in the global conflict, even without a formal declaration of war. Roosevelt had increased military production, expanded naval patrols, and strengthened support for Allied nations. But the final step toward full involvement had not yet been taken. That moment came on December 7, 1941. Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Within hours, the situation changed completely. Ships were destroyed, aircraft were lost, and the scale of the attack made it clear that the United States could no longer remain outside the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not entirely unexpected in a broad sense. Tensions between the United States and Japan had been rising for months. Economic sanctions, trade restrictions, and strategic disagreements had created a situation where conflict seemed increasingly likely. However, the specific timing and execution of the attack caught American forces off guard. The result was immediate and decisive. Public opinion shifted almost overnight. The same country that had been divided over entering the war now showed strong support for action. Roosevelt no longer needed to gradually prepare the nation. The decision was now clear. The following day, Roosevelt addressed Congress. In his speech, he described the attack as a deliberate act that required a response. The tone was direct and focused. There was no longer any ambiguity about the position of the United States. Congress quickly approved the declaration of war against Japan. What had been a gradual movement toward involvement became an official commitment. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, expanding the conflict into a fully global war for America. This sequence of events raised an important question. Had Roosevelt been preparing the country for this moment all along? His earlier actions, from Lend-Lease to naval patrols, had already positioned the United States closer to the conflict. When the attack occurred, the transition from support to full involvement happened rapidly. Critics argued that Roosevelt's policies had increased tensions and made conflict more likely. Supporters believed that his approach ensured the country was ready to respond when the moment came. Regardless of interpretation, the result was the same. The United States entered the war with a level of preparation that had been building for months. What made this moment critical was how quickly it removed any remaining hesitation. The debate over whether to enter the war ended almost instantly. Roosevelt's role shifted from preparing the country to leading it through a global conflict. The focus moved from policy to action, from positioning to execution. The decisions that followed would shape not only how the United States fought the war, but also how it would emerge afterward. And with the country now fully committed, there was no path back to neutrality. With the United States now fully at war, Roosevelt's role shifted from gradual positioning to direct leadership of a global conflict. The challenge was no longer whether to enter the war, but how to fight it effectively on multiple fronts. Europe and the Pacific presented very different situations, each requiring resources, planning, and coordination at a massive scale. Roosevelt worked closely with military leaders to establish priorities, and one of the most important decisions was the Europe First strategy. Despite the immediate impact of Pearl Harbor, the United States chose to focus its main efforts on defeating Germany before turning full attention to Japan. This decision was not universally accepted. Many Americans wanted immediate retaliation against Japan, the nation that had directly attacked them. However, Roosevelt and his advisers believed that Germany posed a greater long-term threat. Germany's position in Europe, its industrial strength, and its ongoing operations made it a more urgent target. By prioritizing Europe, the United States aligned itself with its allies, particularly Britain and the Soviet Union, creating a coordinated effort against a common enemy. This required careful management of resources, ensuring that both fronts could be sustained without weakening overall strategy. At the same time, Roosevelt oversaw the transformation of the United States into a full wartime economy. Industrial production increased rapidly, with factories shifting from civilian goods to military equipment. Aircraft, ships, tanks, and supplies were produced at levels that had not been seen before. This expansion was essential to supporting operations overseas. It allowed the United States not only to equip its own forces, but also to continue supporting its allies. The scale of production became a key factor in the war effort, reinforcing the strategy that had been set. Coordination with Allied leaders became another critical element. Roosevelt worked with figures such as Churchill and Stalin to align military plans and share resources. Conferences were held to determine the direction of major operations, including the eventual invasion of Western Europe. These discussions shaped how the war would be fought and how victory would be pursued. Roosevelt's role in these interactions was central, balancing different perspectives while maintaining a unified approach. What made this phase significant was that Roosevelt was no longer guiding the country toward war. He was directing its participation in it. The decisions made during this period affected every aspect of the conflict, from where resources were allocated to how operations were planned. The groundwork that had been laid before the United States entered the war now supported a coordinated effort on a global scale, and as the war continued, the impact of these decisions would become increasingly visible on the battlefield. As the war progressed, the impact of Roosevelt's decisions became increasingly visible. The United States was no longer just participating in the conflict. It had become one of the central forces shaping its outcome. The industrial expansion, strategic coordination, and military planning that had been set in motion earlier were now operating at full scale. American forces were engaged across multiple fronts, supporting major operations in both Europe and the Pacific. What had started as a cautious approach to involvement had developed into a full commitment that influenced the direction of the war itself. One of the defining aspects of Roosevelt's leadership during this phase was his ability to maintain alignment with Allied powers. Cooperation with Britain and the Soviet Union remained essential, even as differences in priorities and ideology became more apparent. Roosevelt continued to work toward a coordinated strategy, ensuring that efforts were focused on common objectives. This cooperation was critical in planning large-scale operations, including the eventual invasion of Western Europe. By maintaining these alliances, Roosevelt helped create a unified front that increased the effectiveness of military actions. At the same time, the scale of the war required continuous adjustment. Conditions changed rapidly, and decisions had to be made based on evolving situations. Roosevelt relied on military advisors, but he remained closely involved in key strategic choices. The balance between Europe and the Pacific, the allocation of resources, and the timing of operations all required careful consideration. These decisions were not made in isolation. Each one affected multiple aspects of the war effort, and the consequences extended beyond immediate outcomes. As the war moved toward its later stages, the results of these decisions became clearer. Germany was being pushed back on multiple fronts, and the coordinated efforts of Allied forces began to shift the balance decisively. In the Pacific, progress continued, supported by the same industrial and strategic framework. The United States had transitioned from a nation debating involvement to a central force driving the conflict toward its conclusion. Roosevelt's earlier actions had positioned the country to respond quickly, and his leadership during the war ensured that those capabilities were used effectively. What makes this story significant is how it reflects a gradual but deliberate shift. The United States did not move from neutrality to full involvement in a single moment. It was a process shaped by decisions, adjustments, and responses to changing conditions. Roosevelt played a key role in that process, guiding the country through a period of uncertainty and into a position of influence. By the time the war approached its end, the path that had been set was clear. The United States had become fully engaged, and its role in shaping the outcome was firmly established.